Long before written law or organized religion, violence was not hidden. It was part of how societies explained the world. When crops failed, when sickness spread, or when storms destroyed villages, people searched for meaning. To them, pain was communication. If the gods were angry, blood could make peace again. Archaeologists have uncovered proof of this belief in nearly every corner of the ancient pagan world. In northern Europe, the ground still gives up bodies that tell the story. They are not buried in graves, but laid carefully or brutally in wetlands, lakes and bogs. Their faces are preserved by the acid of the peat. Their skin, still dark and leathery after 2,000 years, shows deep cuts, ligatures around the neck, and wounds that could not have come from accident or war. One of the most famous, the Tullen man from Denmark, was found with a leather noose tied around his throat. His eyes and mouth were gently closed, as if he had accepted his fate. But the calm expression hides what came before. His body shows bruises, and the rope's knot rests beneath the chin, a sign he may have been strangled slowly, not dropped to break the neck. In the same region, others were stabbed, beaten, and then drowned. These deaths followed patterns. They were not crimes of passion, but rituals of control. To the people who performed them, sacrifice was not cruelty, it was necessity. Every death carried a purpose: to restore balance, to please a deity, to ensure the survival of the group. The chosen victims might have been criminals, war captives, or even kings who failed their land. Ancient Irish legends describe rulers bound and killed when the harvests failed, their bodies offered back to the soil that had betrayed them. Excavations in Ireland reveal this was more than legend. The old Pagan man, found in a bog west of Dublin, had his nipples cut and arms pierced by wooden stakes. His torso alone remained. Historians suggest the cutting of nipples meant the removal of kingship, a symbolic rejection by his people. He had once worn a leather armband decorated with bronze, a mark of status. His body, mutilated and sunk in the bog, was a message to the gods and to the living. The king had failed. The Celts and Germanic tribes often combined torture with worship. Roman authors recorded sacrifices to gods like Teutates, Taranis, and Isis. Victims dedicated to Teutates were drowned, those to Isis were hanged or stabbed, and to Taranis burned in wooden effigies or iron cages. The Romans exaggerated some of these accounts for propaganda, but archaeology confirms that parts were true. Burned human bones, mixed with animal remains, have been found in ritual pits across Gaul and Britain. Burning was not only punishment, it was purification. Fire released the soul to the heavens, smoke carrying it toward divine realms. To the people watching, it was not murder, it was duty. The crowd would have smelled pitch, resin, and charred fat. The sound of fire devouring wood and flesh was part of the ceremony. Across northern Europe, forests served as temples. No stone altars were needed. Offerings were made beneath sacred trees, and sometimes those offerings were human. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of Germanic priests hanging victims in groves sacred to Odin, their bodies left to sway in the wind. Others were impaled on wooden stakes and left to rot, a sight meant to remind everyone of divine power. The same pattern appears among the Slavs, who even centuries later burned and dismembered captives as part of rituals dedicated to Perun or Veles. The pain inflicted, the order of wounds, the position of the body, all followed rules. In many cases, the killing took hours. Victims might be cut, strangled, then drowned or burned, as if each element, iron, air, water, fire, needed to take part. To modern eyes, it looks like sadism. To them, it was the balance of the world being restored. Sometimes the victims were not outsiders. In bad years, a respected man or woman could be chosen as a scapegoat, believed to carry the misfortune of the tribe. They would be treated with ritual care, dressed in fine clothes, and then killed with the same precision. Death was meant to cleanse the community. It was both horror and hope. In this world, mercy was not a virtue. The gods demanded attention, and pain was the language used to speak to them. Human sacrifice was a cornerstone of many early European religions. Across the continent, before Christianity reshaped beliefs, people turned to the gods through blood. In times of hunger, war, or disease, they looked for meaning, and sacrifice was their answer. They believed the gods demanded life to maintain the balance of the world. Archaeology confirms this was not myth. In the wetlands of Denmark, Ireland, Germany, and England, hundreds of human remains have been unearthed. The bodies are so well preserved that scientists can still read the story written on their skin. Rope marks on the neck, broken bones, and deliberate wounds tell of deaths that were not accidental. They were staged. They were offerings. Among the Celts, the practice was widespread. Roman writers, including Julius Caesar, described how the Druids performed sacrifices to please gods. Caesar claimed that large wicker figures, enormous cages woven from branches, were filled with living people and set on fire as offerings. While his words likely exaggerated the scale, later evidence shows that fire rituals were indeed real. Burned human bones mixed with animal remains have been found in pits and shrines across Gaul and Britain. The Celts saw flames as a bridge to the divine, a way to send the victim's spirit upward to the gods. These sacrifices were not limited to prisoners. In some tribes, they chose their own. High-status individuals, sometimes even kings, were killed to restore luck to the land. The belief was simple. If the harvest failed or the tribe suffered, the leader must have offended the gods. His death could make things right again. This idea of the sacred king survived in myth and ritual for centuries. In Ireland, the killing of a ruler symbolically renewed the bond between the land and its people. Further north, Germanic and Nordic societies also used sacrifice to communicate with their gods. The historian Tacitus wrote that in sacred groves, victims were hanged from trees as offerings to Odin. Others were stabbed, and their blood poured onto the roots of trees or sacred stones. Excavations in these regions confirm such acts. Bones pierced by stakes and skulls with deliberate fractures suggest carefully arranged deaths, not random violence. The sacrifices were often performed in public, with witnesses, so that everyone could see that order was being restored. Each ritual followed a structure. The killing method depended on the god being honored. Drowning symbolized the return of life to the underworld. Hanging or strangling offered the soul to the sky. Burning delivered it through smoke. For many tribes, the type of death was more than punishment. It was communication. The victim's suffering was seen as a form of prayer. Children were not exempt. In the ancient city of Carthage, though not European, excavations revealed burial grounds filled with urns containing the burned remains of infants and small children. Some scholars still debate whether these were sacrifices or natural deaths, later ritualized, but the evidence leans toward deliberate killing. Similar customs existed among Celts and other pagans. The younger the life, the purer the offering. To the modern listener, these acts sound monstrous. But in the minds of those who performed them, the logic was consistent. Life was a transaction. The gods gave rain, sun, and strength, and when they withheld it, payment was due. To refuse sacrifice was to risk the survival of the tribe. In that sense, cruelty was duty. Archaeological digs across Britain and Ireland show how normalized these acts were. In pits near old settlements, human bones lie beside pottery, tools, and animal remains. Some skulls were placed on posts. Others were buried under doorways or near fields, likely to bless the home or harvest. The people who lived there did not see death as an end. They saw it as part of a cycle, something that could be managed, even bargained with. In early Europe, religion was not peaceful or private. It was physical, an exchange written in blood. The Viking Age brought a unique relationship between violence and belief. In their world, death was not shameful if it carried meaning. Courage in the face of agony was seen as the ultimate proof of honor, and torture was often used to demonstrate both vengeance and devotion to the gods. Among the methods described in later sagas, none is more infamous than what came to be known as the blood eagle. The blood eagle was not a punishment given to common thieves or cowards. It was reserved for traitors, oath-breakers, and enemies. In the sagas, this ritual was described as an act of vengeance and glory. The victim would be seized after battle or taken from their home, bound, and placed face down on a flat surface, sometimes a shield, sometimes a wooden board. The executioner would then take a sharp blade or axe and begin cutting into the back along both sides of the spine. The ribs were severed one by one, pulled outward, and the lungs were lifted through the openings to resemble the spread of wings. In some descriptions, salt was poured into the wounds. The act was slow, deliberate, and meant to be witnessed. Modern historians debate whether the blood eagle truly happened or if it was symbolic exaggeration by later poets. The earliest written sources are sagas recorded centuries after the events they describe, mixing history and legend. But the procedure itself fits within the Viking worldview where sacrifice, revenge, and ritual killing were intertwined. Some scholars argue that the blood eagle may have been a stylized form of execution, perhaps cutting open the back of the victim without completing the full dissection. Others believe it was entirely possible in rare cases, meant to send a terrifying message. The sagas mention the blood eagle being performed on kings and powerful men. One of the most famous accounts is that of King Ella of Northumbria, who according to Norse tradition was executed in this way by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ella had supposedly captured and killed Ragnar, throwing him into a pit of snakes. In revenge, Ragnar's sons invaded England. When they caught Ella, they marked his back with the outline of an eagle and performed the ritual. Whether true or not, the image of a man's lungs stretched like wings became one of the most enduring symbols of Norse brutality. Archaeological evidence of the blood eagle itself is inconclusive. No skeletons have been found that show the exact pattern of rib separation described in the sagas, though there are bodies from the Viking period showing extreme mutilation, skulls split, bones shattered, torsos pierced. What can be confirmed is that the Vikings practiced ritual sacrifice, both of animals and humans, during major festivals like the Blot. These sacrifices were dedicated to Odin, Freya, and other gods to ensure good harvests, victory, or safe voyages. Victims were sometimes hanged from trees, stabbed with spears, or drowned in wells and lakes. In the Norse worldview, such acts were not seen as sadism. They were offerings. The pain was not meaningless. It was a bridge between men and gods. The Vikings believed that death was not an end, but a transition. To die bravely, even in agony, was to approach Valhalla with honor. The victim, even in suffering, was part of something sacred. What made the blood eagle so horrifying to later generations was not only the physical act, but the intent behind it. It was not done in rage or chaos. It was organized, deliberate, and solemn. Those who performed it did so with composure, believing they were fulfilling divine justice. To them, fear itself was power. Watching the ritual reminded others what awaited those who broke sacred oaths. If you could have stood there, you would not have seen madness. You would have seen calm faces, steady hands, and men reciting prayers to Odin as they worked. You would have heard the sound of blades cutting into flesh, ribs cracking, and the dull wind over the fjord carrying every breath. The smell of blood, salt, and smoke from nearby fires would have mixed in the air. To the Vikings, this was not horror. It was order being restored. Whether myth or truth, the blood eagle remains the clearest image of how far belief could shape cruelty. It shows that in the pagan world, the boundary between faith and violence was often non-existent. Pain was not chaos, it was ritual. Death was not shame, it was purpose. The descriptions of the blood eagle vary between sagas, but most share the same sequence of steps, and together they outline one of the most brutal executions ever recorded in early Europe. The victim would be captured alive, often a noble or a warrior of rank. Before the act began, there was silence. Witnesses stood in a semicircle, close enough to see but not to interfere. The man performing the blood eagle was usually someone with status, a chieftain or a close relative of the offended party. This was not the work of an executioner. It was vengeance carried out by hand. First came the incision along the spine. The blade, usually an iron knife or small axe, cut deeply down both sides of the backbone. The Vikings' blades were crude by modern standards, but sharp enough to separate flesh from bone. The air would fill with the sound of slow cutting and the low groans of the dying man. Once the ribs were exposed, they were split outward one by one, using the axe head or a small hammer. The force required was enormous. Each break echoed in the open air, and with every crack, the lungs became more visible through the torn muscle and skin. After the ribs were bent outward, the executioner reached inside and pulled the lungs out through the openings, spreading them across the victim's back to form what they called wings. Salt or herbs were sometimes rubbed into the wounds, part ritual, part display of dominance. The act could last for several minutes, if the man was still alive when it began. Some accounts claim that a true blood eagle could only be considered complete if the victim did not scream, proving his courage until death. Modern anatomical analysis shows that performing the blood eagle exactly as described would have been nearly impossible without killing the victim very early in the process. Severing the ribs from the spine would puncture lungs and arteries immediately. That means the wings described in later writings were likely symbolic, exaggerated to heighten the legend of Norse cruelty. Still, the underlying act, cutting open the back, displaying the ribs, leaving the corpse as a warning, is considered plausible. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia show several bodies with severe mutilation of the back and ribs consistent with post-mortem display. The blood eagle represented more than punishment. It was a statement about power and fate. For the Vikings, death was inevitable, but the manner of death defined a person's worth. A warrior who faced agony without begging honored his gods. A traitor who screamed confirmed his guilt. Each cry, each drop of blood, carried meaning. Even in its brutality, the ritual followed rules. The witnesses were not mere spectators, they were part of the message. Seeing the blood eagle perform served as both fear and reminder that divine law was beyond question, that betrayal would not end in a simple death. When the ritual was finished, the body was left in the open, the lungs blackened by air, and the ribs like broken branches. Ravens and wolves were often left to feed, completing the cycle that the Norse saw as natural, blood returning to earth and sky. In some sagas, the blood eagle was linked to offerings for Odin, who was said to favor the hanged and the sacrificed. The image of lungs spread like wings might have symbolized the victim's soul, offered to the god of war. Whether true or poetic invention, the logic fit perfectly within their world, a world where pain was communication and death was a bridge to divine power. In later centuries, Christian chroniclers used the blood eagle as proof of Viking savagery. To them, it represented barbarism without purpose. But from the Norse view, it was structure and justice. The difference lay not in what was done, but in what people believed it meant. Feud, honor, and fear governed the moral code of early pagan societies. Laws existed, but they were bound by reputation, family, and vengeance, rather than by written rule. When blood was spilled unjustly, it had to be repaid. To leave an insult unanswered was weakness. To accept it was shame. In that environment, torture and execution were not hidden acts, they were the visible proof that justice had been restored. Among the Norse, the Celts, and the Germanic tribes, honor was everything. A man's name and family lineage determined his value, and losing that honor through cowardice or betrayal was worse than death. Feuds between clans could last for generations, each side claiming divine approval for its actions. Killing an enemy was not enough. One had to demonstrate strength, to humiliate the opponent's kin, and to remind the gods that the balance had been repaid. This is why punishments were often public, drawn out, and symbolic. The greater the insult, the greater the suffering demanded in return. The sagas are filled with examples of such cycles. One clan kills another's leader. Years later, the surviving sons capture one of their enemies and make an example of him. The torture itself is not described as pleasure, but as duty. Pain became part of the moral economy, a transaction where blood balanced blood. In this way, even brutal acts gained legitimacy. When men were tortured, they were not seen as victims, but as participants in an ancient equation of revenge and respect. For many tribes, death by torture also reinforced hierarchy. The chief or king decided the sentence, but it was the community that witnessed it. Everyone watched, because the act was as much a warning as it was a punishment. If one man could be stripped of his status, tied, and broken, then all others understood where power truly rested. The screams were not only a deterrent but a form of social order. In the Celtic and Germanic world, rituals of vengeance often merged with religion. The execution site was sacred ground, groves, clearings, or stones dedicated to specific gods. The death itself could serve two purposes: retribution for a crime and an offering to a deity. The victim's blood fed both. Roman accounts of the Gauls and the Germanic tribes describe warriors swearing oaths to the gods before killing prisoners, believing that vengeance carried spiritual value. In their minds, it restored honor not only among men but also before the divine. If you were to stand in such a gathering, the scene would feel both organized and chaotic. The condemned bound or nailed to wood, surrounded by men chanting or shouting, the smell of sweat, iron, and smoke, the sound of axes hitting bone. Women watching from behind fires, children kept at distance. To the crowd, it was not cruelty but ceremony, a living lesson about power and faith. It was the visible enforcement of the unwritten law. No insult goes unanswered, and no coward goes unpunished. Feuds shape the rhythm of life. In a world without central authority, vengeance acted as government. Honor served as currency. If a man was murdered, his family had the right, even the obligation, to take another life. If the balance was not kept, the dead were believed to haunt the living. This fear of spiritual unrest drove many of the cruelest acts. Pain did not only punish, it satisfied both the living and the gods. Over time, torture became an art of control. It sent a message across villages and generations. Order came through fear. The rituals that began as sacrifice evolved into social tools. The line between religion and justice blurred until they became one. What the modern world calls barbarity, they called necessity. And for centuries that belief held their societies together. Ireland in the Iron Age was a land of thick forests, endless bogs, and deep superstition. Much of what is known about life and death there comes not from writing, but from the bodies that the bogs themselves preserved. These wetlands acted like natural tombs, sealing away not only the remains of the dead, but also the truth about how and why they were killed. When archaeologists began uncovering them, they found that these were not ordinary burials. They were executions, sacrifices, or both. The Irish bog bodies tell a story of violent ritual. Each one carries marks of deliberate harm: strangulation, stabbing, dismemberment, or drowning. In several cases, all of these were done to the same person. The pattern is clear. These deaths were organized, not chaotic. They were acts of ceremony, shaped by belief. The people who carried them out saw themselves as fulfilling sacred duty, not committing murder. The most famous discoveries, Tolland Man and Grobala Man in Denmark, but also Old Krogan Man and Clonacavon Man in Ireland, share the same hallmarks. They were healthy men in their 20s or 30s, physically strong, likely of high status. Their last meals, still preserved in their stomachs, consisted of grains and seeds. Around their necks, ropes or leather cords were tied in tight loops. Their skin bears cuts that show the precision of practiced hands. Some were decapitated. Others were stabbed in the chest or pelvis, blows aimed not at killing instantly, but at ensuring suffering. In a few, nipples were cut or bitten off, a symbolic act connected to kingship. In ancient Irish custom, the king's body represented the fertility of the land. If he failed, if crops rotted, cattle died, or famine struck, he was seen as responsible. His body, once sacred, became an offering. Cutting the nipples meant he could no longer rule or be suckled by the symbolic mother of the land. Killing him was meant to restore balance between people and nature. His corpse was often left in the bog, where the earth's dark water swallowed it. To the living, it was a return, the failed ruler given back to the soil. The bogs also served a practical purpose. The airless peat preserved the body and removed its odor, allowing it to remain visible far longer than a normal grave. In some cases, the corpses were placed along tribal boundaries, physical warnings marking where one kingdom ended and another began. Anyone crossing would see what happened to those who defied power or offended the gods. The stillness of the bog made it the perfect place for such messages. The surface could appear calm and undisturbed, while just beneath, the body remained intact, hidden yet eternal. The combination of multiple injuries, strangling, cutting, drowning, was significant. It symbolized offering the victim to all elements. The rope represented air, the cut represented fire or iron, and the bog water represented the underworld. By killing through more than one method, they honored multiple deities at once, ensuring no god was neglected. Imagine what such a ritual must have been like. The condemned brought to the edge of a bog at dawn. A crowd of villagers gathered in silence. The priest or chief reciting prayers to the gods, invoking the land's name. The rope prepared, the knife waiting. The first blow draws blood. The rope tightens. The body shakes. The bog's black water reflects the pale sky. When it is over, the victim is pushed into the mud, and the crowd disperses. To them, nothing unnatural has occurred. The gods have been fed, and life will continue. Centuries later, when these bodies were found, the people who uncovered them described an eerie sense of presence, as if the dead had only just been placed there. Their faces still intact, eyes closed, lips slightly open. Even now, scientists can see the pores in their skin and the fine hair on their heads. The violence has become history, but the expressions remain calm, frozen between agony and peace. The bogs of Ireland preserved more than flesh, they preserved belief. They remind us that for the ancient pagan, torture was not cruelty for its own sake. It was an act of control over nature, over destiny, and over fear itself. In their world, death was not the end, but the negotiation between man and the unseen powers that ruled his life. The discovery of the old Crogan man in 2003 gave the clearest glimpse yet into what happened when a king failed his people. His remains were found in a bog near Offaly, Ireland. Only the torso perfectly preserved by the peat, the skin dark and supple, the fingernails still visible. He had been around 6 feet 6 inches tall in life, unusually large for his time. His body bore the marks of privilege and brutality, manicured nails, suggesting he had never worked the land, well-fed flesh, and a braided leather armband decorated with bronze, the kind of ornament worn only by the elite. What was done to him was not random. His arms had deep cuts near the elbows, where hazel stakes had been driven through, pinning him in place before death. His nipples had been sliced off. Around his neck was a braided rope, tight enough to cut into the skin. Across his torso ran fine cuts, likely made by a blade drawn with ritual care. He had been stabbed in the chest, and finally sliced across the throat. Then his body was dismembered at the waist, his upper half placed into the bog while the rest was discarded. Every injury served a purpose, a layer of meaning known to the people who killed him. In Iron Age Ireland, the king's body symbolized the health of the land. When famine, plague, or political failure struck, people believed that the ruler's connection to the earth had broken. The only way to heal it was to give him back to the soil that had rejected him. The removal of the nipples carried political and religious weight. In Gaelic custom, subjects showed loyalty by symbolically suckling the king's nipple during coronation rites. By cutting them off, his killers stripped him of legitimacy. The binding and stabbing represented submission to divine judgment. His placement in the bog completed the ritual. He was returned to the earth to restore fertility and balance. Nearby discoveries confirm that this was not an isolated act. Clonacavin man, found not far away, was killed in a similar fashion. His skull had been split by a heavy blow, his abdomen opened, his body also placed in a bog. Chemical analysis of his hair showed traces of imported pine resin used as hair gel, proof of high status. Like old Crogan man, he was not a peasant or criminal. He was a leader, chosen to die for reasons that likely involved both politics and religion. The pattern appears across Ireland and beyond. Each of these men died violently but deliberately. Their bodies were treated with care afterward, positioned rather than discarded, often folded with hands across the chest or face turned upward. It was not a lynching, it was ceremony. Those who watched probably did so in silence, convinced that the death of one powerful man would bring calm to the world again. Modern forensic work reveals just how calculated these killings were. The cuts were not wild slashes but precise, made with iron blades. The ropes were woven from materials used in religious crafts. Even the locations were chosen carefully, near borders or natural landmarks. The bog was more than a dumping ground. It was the doorway to the other world, a sacred place where the boundary between life and death was thin. When scientists lifted old Krogan man from the peat, they found his last meal in his stomach, a mix of buttermilk and grains. Simple food, possibly eaten as part of ritual preparation. It suggested that he knew what was coming. Perhaps he had accepted it, believing his death would restore the favor of the gods. Or perhaps he had no choice, condemned by his people as a necessary offering. Either way, his calm, preserved face looks neither fearful nor angry. It looks resigned, as if he understood that this was the cost of kingship. To modern eyes, it is unthinkable that a society could turn its ruler into a sacrifice. But in a world where nature dictated survival, leadership was spiritual as much as political. His body was both victim and cure. When his blood sank into the bog, the people believed the land would breathe again, the crops would grow, and the gods would be appeased. Even now, standing over the glass case that holds what remains of him, it's hard not to feel the weight of that belief. The bog kept his body, but it also kept the echo of the world that killed him, a world where power and pain were inseparable, and where faith demanded blood. The phrase throats cut, nipples severed, bound and buried could describe a crime scene, but in the Iron Age, it described ritual order. Across Ireland, Denmark and northern Germany, the same pattern repeats itself in body after body. A man or woman killed, not by accident or rage, but through an exact series of wounds, meant to communicate something to gods, land, or tribe. One of the most common marks is the deep cut across the throat. It appears on victims from Lindo Moss in England, from Yeed in the Netherlands, and from the Irish Midlands. The cut is clean, sharp, and deliberate, often following other injuries. This suggests that the throat was opened not to kill instantly, but to complete the act, a final offering of breath and blood. In many cases, the head was then twisted or removed entirely, separating the life force from the body. In Celtic and Germanic belief, the head held the soul. Keeping it was keeping power. The nipples, as seen on Old Krogan man and others, were mutilated for reasons bound to kingship and humiliation. To cut them off was to unmake a ruler, to erase his sacred bond with the land. The gesture was political and religious at once. It reduced a leader to flesh, stripped of the divine right he had claimed. No other wound carried such layered meaning. Bogs, graves, and ritual pits reveal wrists tied behind backs with twisted cords or hazel withes. Some victims had their arms bent and pinned, others had knees drawn to the chest. Rope marks cut deep into skin, showing that the bindings were tightened while the person was still alive. The purpose was control, not only of the body but of the soul. To bind a man was to prevent his spirit from wandering before it was offered to the gods. The burial that followed was not random disposal. The bodies were positioned carefully. Heads to the north, faces to the sky, limbs folded in certain directions. Archaeologists have mapped these orientations and found patterns repeating across hundreds of miles. It points to shared customs, a common ritual logic that outlived individual tribes. Each placement was symbolic. Facing upward might mean surrender to the heavens. Face down could signify guilt or shame. In some cases, after the throat was cut, the victim was partially burned or stabbed again before burial. The combination of elements, fire, iron, water, reflected a belief that multiple forces had to witness the act. To please one god was not enough. Air, earth, and flame all required acknowledgement. This is why so many of these bodies show more than one cause of death. They were not overkilled from frenzy but by design. Each wound checked a spiritual box. The physical evidence is brutal to read in modern reports. On Grobal man, the cut from ear to ear severed his windpipe and major vessels. On Lindo man, the skull was fractured, the neck broken, the throat cut, and the body placed face down in peat. The sequence suggests a ritual of triple death, hanging, stabbing, and drowning. Found in Celtic myth, the gods received the soul through all elements at once. To those who performed it, this violence was duty, not cruelty. They believed that suffering opened a door. The victim's breath, spilling through a slit throat, joined the wind. His blood darkened the soil that would later feed crops. The rope marks around his arms became symbols of sacrifice, proof that the tribe had paid its debt. When these bodies were uncovered millennia later, they were so intact that fingerprints remained. The peat had turned their skin to a deep brown leather, the wounds still visible. Scientists can see where blades entered, where ropes bit, where bones snapped. Every mark is both evidence and testimony. It shows a people who lived without separation between faith and fear, where torture was the grammar of belief. Standing before one of these remains in a museum case, it is difficult not to see the precision. The cuts follow lines of anatomy, not chaos. Even death was organized. These were not monsters at work, but believers, farmers, priests, warriors, doing what they thought was necessary to hold their fragile world together. Modern historians and archaeologists still argue where to draw the line between ritual and torture. The bodies in the bogs and the stories written by Romans both describe acts that combine punishment, sacrifice, and ceremony. To the people who carried them out, there was no separation between religion and justice. Every cut and every burn carried purpose. But from a modern perspective, it is hard to tell if those who suffered died as offerings to gods or as victims of social control. The term ritual killing appears often in excavation reports, yet even the experts hesitate to define it. When a man is strangled, stabbed, and then buried with care, was he sacrificed or executed? When his corpse is displayed to the community, is it devotion or deterrence? The same action could mean both. Pagan societies did not see contradiction in that. The gods demanded blood and human authority demanded obedience. Roman writers like Julius Caesar and Tacitus left vivid accounts of these practices among Celts and Germans. Caesar described giant wicker figures filled with prisoners and set on fire, while Tacitus spoke of sacred groves where victims were hanged or impaled for the gods. Archaeology confirms fragments of truth in these reports. Burned bones, human remains mingled with offerings, but also shows exaggeration. The Romans used stories of barbaric rites to justify conquest and conversion. Still, the core idea holds. Torture was accepted, even expected, as part of maintaining order and faith. The victims were not always outsiders. In many cases, they were chosen from within the tribe, people accused of breaking taboos, betraying oaths, or bringing misfortune. Their deaths purified the group. The pain they endured served a spiritual function. It removed guilt from the community and placed it on one body. In that sense, torture was not chaos, but cleansing. If you had lived then, you would not have seen execution as cruelty. You would have seen it as correction. The gods were thought to watch closely. Failing to punish wrongdoing could bring disease, bad weather, or loss in battle. To avoid that, leaders made sure the rituals were public, visible, and terrifying. The fear they created kept order better than any written law. The line between ritual and punishment also blurs in the tools that were used. Archaeologists have found spears and knives with traces of blood near ancient altars, as well as posts and ropes buried alongside human remains. These were not the instruments of battle, but of ceremony. Yet they were also instruments of terror. To bind a man, cut him, and offer him to the gods was both a sentence and a prayer. Modern ethics makes it easy to call such acts barbaric, but to those who lived by them, they were coherent. The scream was a form of speech between people and their gods. Every wound said, "We have paid our debt. Leave us in peace." When the ritual ended, the silence that followed meant safety. The community could eat, sleep, and plant again, believing the world was back in balance. Historians who study this subject often find themselves trapped between empathy and analysis. The evidence speaks of horror, but also of structure and meaning. Torture was not madness, it was governance, theology, and order, all bound into one act. The same logic later carried into medieval Europe, where executions remained public theater, though stripped of the old gods. To call these acts torture is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Torture implies cruelty for pleasure or confession. These killings were something different. They were systems of faith. The pain was real, the death slow, but to those who held the ropes and knives, it was not about satisfaction. It was about survival of crops, of order, of the fragile link between man and nature. Northern Europe in the Iron Age and early Viking era was a place of harsh winters and short summers. Life depended entirely on the mercy of weather, sea, and soil. When storms ruined crops or sickness spread through livestock, people turned to their gods with fear and desperation. In that world, sacrifice was not superstition, it was survival. The rituals performed along fjords, forests, and coastal settlements reveal how deeply belief and violence were intertwined. Excavations at sites like Trelleborg, Gamla Uppsala, and Rieb show the remains of sacrificial pits filled with bones of both animals and humans. Horses, dogs, and cattle were killed beside men and women. The victims were often chosen during religious gatherings known as blot, where entire communities came together to thank the gods or beg for help. Alcohol flowed. Fires burned through the night, and at the center of it all stood the altar, a stone slab or wooden platform dark with old blood. Contemporary accounts, such as those of the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe what these scenes may have looked like. He witnessed a Norse funeral in the 10th century, where a female slave volunteered to die with her master. She was given alcohol to numb her senses, then led to a wooden platform and stabbed repeatedly while men beat drums and women sang. Her body was then placed beside her master on a ship, which was burned and buried. This was not murder in their eyes. It was ritual continuation, ensuring that the dead would not travel alone to the afterlife. In Scandinavia, fire had a central role in sacrifice. It purified and released the soul to the heavens. At the same time, it demonstrated power, the ability to turn flesh into smoke. Some victims were burned alive, their screams drowned by chanting. Others were partially roasted after death, their flesh offered to the gods as food. Archaeologists have found pits filled with charred bones and ashes, mixed with offerings of jewelry, tools, and weapons. To the pagans, these items fed the gods in the same way a feast fed men. Human remains found in fjord-side altars show clear evidence of preparation before death. The bodies were cleaned, sometimes shaved or painted, and dressed in specific clothing. The executioners used ropes, knives, and hooks. Ropes left marks on the wrists and necks. Knives left deep symmetrical cuts. Hooks tore at shoulders and ribs, often used to hang the bodies after death. The victims were positioned to face east or west, corresponding to the direction of the rising or setting sun, a symbolic gesture toward the cycle of life and death. Firelight flickering on wet rock would have cast long shadows across the gathering. The smell was thick, blood, wood smoke, and salt from the sea air. The crowd stood still as priests recited old words, thanking Odin, Thor, or Freya for strength and demanding mercy. When the blade fell or the torch was dropped, no one screamed except the victim. For everyone else, it was order being maintained. The gods had been fed, and the land would hopefully be kind again. To modern ears, these scenes sound like madness. But to those people, they were acts of balance. Nature was unpredictable, and suffering was a form of currency. A storm, a failed harvest, or an epidemic meant that something had gone unpaid. By burning or cutting, they believed they were paying what was owed. The fire turned fear into smoke, a visible sign that they were doing their part to keep the world from collapsing. What is striking in the archaeological record is the consistency. From Norway to Denmark and into northern Germany, the same types of wounds appear: throats cut, ribs punctured, skulls crushed, bones split by heat. The repetition shows system, not chaos. These were not spontaneous killings, but rehearsed acts passed down through generations. It is easy to imagine these rituals as sadistic, but they were built on belief. Pain was an offering. Blood was the proof that the gods were listening. Fire, water, and flesh were the tools used to speak to forces they could neither see nor control. When the bodies were finally removed from the altar or pyre, what remained, ash, bone, or burnt wood, was buried carefully. Sometimes near fields, sometimes near the sea, so that the gods' favor would reach both land and water. The people who left those remains behind did not think of cruelty or sin. Chains, cords, hooks, and stakes. These were the tools that kept order long before laws were written. Across pre-Christian Europe, restraint itself was sacred. Binding was both a practical act and a symbolic one. To tie a man was to claim him. To hang him was to offer him. Every mark left by rope or chain was part of the ritual language used to communicate with the gods. In Germanic and Norse societies, iron was more than metal. It was magic. Weapons, nails, and chains forged from it held spiritual power. Archaeologists have found iron hooks driven into wooden posts at sacrificial sites, with traces of human bone and sinew still attached. Some were used to suspend bodies by the shoulders or ribs. Others were used after death, to display victims to the public. Hanging, piercing, and displaying were all forms of communication, visible messages about justice and belief. Tacitus wrote that the Germanic tribes dedicated their victims to Odin by hanging them from trees in sacred groves. The choice of the tree mattered. Oak and ash were believed to be channels between the human world and the divine. To hang someone there was to send them upward, closer to the gods. Rope marks found on bog bodies and skeletons near former groves confirm this. The loops are tight, with fibers still embedded in the skin. These were not fast deaths. The victims were lifted slowly, sometimes by pulleys or branches bent under tension, ensuring that life faded gradually. Chains appear later in the archaeological record, around the early Iron Age, as smelting advanced. Unlike rope, iron was permanent. It symbolized domination, man's mastery over the earth's raw material. In pagan rituals, the clinking of chains was the sound of inevitability. They were used to drag captives, restrain criminals, or suspend offerings above fire or water. In some sites, chains were buried with the dead, possibly to bind their spirits and prevent return. Hooks, usually made from bone or bronze, served a similar dual purpose. Some were tools for skinning animals, others adapted for human flesh. In graves from northern Germany, small curved hooks have been found near rib cages, sometimes still wedged between bones. They could have been used to open bodies or to hang them for display. The repetition of placements suggests ritual rather than chance. To pierce and display was to show both punishment and piety. Binding was also part of everyday justice. Before the spread of Christianity, public punishment acted as both deterrent and worship. Offenders were tied to posts, lashed or left for the elements. In tribal law, physical restraint was a statement of control, confirming that society could subdue chaos. The act itself carried religious undertones. By restraining the guilty, the community imitated the gods restraining the forces of destruction. The most chilling evidence comes from sacrificial wells and bogs, where bodies were deliberately entangled before being sunk. At Illerup Adal in Denmark, piles of weapons and the remains of warriors were thrown into a lake, many bound together in clusters. Some were tied with plant fibers, others with metal. The bindings ensured that they would never rise again, neither as enemies nor as spirits. In the minds of those who performed the ritual, the bindings completed the offering. The gods received not free souls, but captured ones, unable to return. The consistency across regions shows how universal the idea of restraint was. From the Baltic tribes to the Norse to the Celts of Gaul, ropes and chains played the same symbolic role: submission to divine will. Once bound, they belonged to the gods, and whatever followed, hanging, burning, or drowning, was merely the final stage of the transaction. Archaeologists often find bindings still intact, the knots carefully tied, not random. Some even show decorative braiding, as if made for ceremony. This detail says everything about how ordinary these acts had become. Pain was formalized. Death had its own craftsmanship. Chains of the ancients were not only tools of control, but reminders of belief. To live unbound was freedom. To die bound was service. In their world, that distinction decided a person's worth. Across the open plains and near the edges of ancient forests, executions were not private. They were meant to be heard. The cries of the dying carried far over the land, reminding everyone of the laws that ruled their world. Not written laws, but those of fear, obedience, and divine balance. When punishment was performed, the sound itself was part of the ritual. It was a message sent not only to the living, but to the gods. In the societies of Northern and Western Europe, power depended on spectacle. The leaders who ruled these tribes understood that control came through visibility. Pain had to be seen, and more importantly, it had to be heard. Witnesses were not bystanders, they were participants. A silent death meant nothing. The screams were proof that the sentence had been carried out, that the gods had been acknowledged. When a man was sacrificed or executed, the community gathered. The old stood beside the young, warriors beside farmers. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and smoke. The victims were led out, bound, often naked. The priest or chief spoke the charges aloud: betrayal, cowardice, oath-breaking, offense against the gods. The words were not for the condemned, they were for the crowd. The punishment that followed was both religious and political theater. The methods varied by region and reason. In the north, hanging was common. Victims were lifted from the ground, their bodies swaying, their voices fading into short, sharp gasps, until the rope cut off breath entirely. In other regions, the condemned were stabbed or beaten before the final blow. Each community had its own rhythm, an order to how pain was delivered and when the final silence should fall. In some recorded cases, witnesses were encouraged to shout or chant during the act. Their voices mixed with the victims' cries, creating a sound that carried far beyond the ritual site. For those who watched, this was not cruelty. It was duty, a necessary reaffirmation of the tribe's strength. In their minds, fear kept the world from dissolving into chaos. The sounds of these punishments traveled with the wind. Settlements nearby would hear them and understand what had happened. Someone had broken the law or angered the gods, and justice had been restored. Children grew up hearing those sounds as part of life, not as horror. The cries marked boundaries between loyalty and betrayal, between human order and divine wrath. The instruments that created those sounds were simple: wooden mallets striking bone, axes cutting through ribs, the tightening creak of rope, the splash of a body dropped into a bog or lake. Sometimes the sound of fire filled the silence, the hiss of fat dripping into flames, the pop of sap in green wood. Each noise had meaning. It told the community that balance was being repaired. Fear was more powerful than any written decree. In these societies, fear held everything together. It kept men loyal to their chieftain and tribes obedient to their gods. The screams of the condemned were part of that structure. They warned, educated, and sanctified. Those who watched and listened left with the memory of what awaited anyone who stepped outside the accepted path. Occasionally, the victim's family was forced to attend, to watch the process. Their grief was not meant to move the crowd. It was part of the lesson that personal emotion meant nothing compared to collective law. The public display erased individuality. It turned human pain into a communal event. What modern people call torture, the ancients called necessity. The cries that drifted over the hills were not only signals of suffering, but signs of stability. They marked the rhythm of belief, life and death. Each sound carried a message that the gods had received what was owed, that order would return, and that silence, when it finally came, was peace. And when the screaming stopped, what followed was not relief, but reverence. The watchers bowed their heads, the priest spoke final words, and the wind carried away the last trace of breath. The ritual was complete, the gods had been fed, the community could sleep again. In early pagan societies, power and sacrifice were inseparable. The ruler's authority was not measured only by his ability to command or to fight, but by how closely he was believed to stand to the gods. To govern was to mediate between the human world and the divine. When the crops failed, when the herds died, when plague struck, the people did not blame chance, they blamed the ruler. If he could not appease the gods, he had to become the offering himself. This principle, sacrifice as sovereignty, appears across the archaeological record and in ancient myth. The king's body symbolized the fertility of the land, the health of his people, and the favor of the gods. If misfortune continued, it was taken as proof that he had lost divine approval. Killing him was not rebellion. In Iron Age Ireland, this belief is recorded not only in legend, but in the bog bodies themselves. The men found with cut nipples, stabbed chests, and rope marks were not criminals. They were chosen because they carried power. By destroying their bodies, the community renewed its spiritual contract with the earth. The act served both theology and politics. It removed a failed leader and reaffirmed that only divine will determined who ruled next. Similar customs existed among other pagan peoples. In Scandinavia, chronicles describe kings who willingly offered themselves when times turned desperate. The saga of Damalda, a Swedish ruler, tells of his sacrifice after years of famine. When the first offerings of animals and men failed to bring prosperity, the people decided that the king himself must die. Damalda was dragged to the temple of Uppsala and slaughtered so that his blood would sanctify the fields. Whether legend or fact, the story matches the archaeological truth that sacrifice and sovereignty were bound by the same logic. The ruler's body fed the land. In these systems, the king was not merely a political figure, he was the living embodiment of divine order. His health, virility, and fortune were believed to determine the fate of everyone under him. Rituals of kingship involved symbolic marriages to the land, oaths to the gods, and acts of fertility. If he failed in any of these, if famine struck or enemies triumphed, his death became part of the cycle. The act of killing him re-established harmony between gods and humans. Execution scenes described in later Norse and Celtic traditions often retain traces of this origin. The cutting of the throat, the stabbing in the chest, or the symbolic mutilation of the body were not only punishments. The suffering of one became the guarantee of survival for all. If you stood in those gatherings, you would see no chaos, only solemn order. The priests or elders prepared the site, the ropes, the knife, the wood. The ruler, stripped of regalia, might be washed or anointed, as if for burial. Witnesses would chant the old words asking the gods for mercy. The killing was done cleanly, the blood collected or allowed to soak into the ground. The body was then buried in bog or field, its placement marking the boundary between life and renewal. It is tempting to imagine these acts as rebellion or vengeance, but to those who lived them, they were duty. The man who died was not an enemy. He was the payment. His blood was the bridge that reconnected the human world with the divine. The belief was absolute. If he bled, the land would live. Archaeological evidence across Europe supports this connection. Animal bones and human remains found together in offering pits show that sacrifice followed a clear hierarchy. The greater the crisis, the greater the offering. Animals for small misfortunes, slaves for war, kings for famine. The act was brutal, but it was not random. It was a political theology, a structured understanding that leadership and death were two halves of the same contract. The idea that rulers must bleed for their people survived in myth and story long after the last bog body sank beneath the peat. As pagan Europe evolved and tribes turned into kingdoms, the methods of killing also evolved, but the logic behind them remained the same. The transition from sacred groves to public squares did not mark the end of ritual. It simply changed its setting. What had once been done for gods began to be done for order. From the wooded sanctuaries of early pagans came the wheels, posts, and stakes of later Europe. New instruments, the same message. The forest was the first courtroom. There, under ancient oaks or ash trees, sentences were spoken by priests or chieftains. Hanging was the most common form of sacrifice. Simple, direct, and symbolically powerful. The victim was lifted into the air, left to sway between the worlds of men and gods. Fire came next, torches pressed to skin, bodies burned as offerings or punishments. Drowning in lakes and bogs followed, completing the cycle of earth, air, fire, and water. Each death was a conversation with the elements. As societies grew and tribes merged, justice needed to be seen by more people. The sacred grove gave way to the village square. The same gods or their echoes still received the offering, but the stage changed. A wheel or stake made the act visible to hundreds instead of dozens. What was once divine worship became civic performance. The breaking wheel, later infamous in medieval Europe, has its roots in older practices. It was a flat wooden frame, often from a cart, repurposed for punishment. The victim's limbs were tied across it and struck with hammers or clubs until bones shattered. In its earliest forms, this was not only a penalty for crime, but a ritual of exclusion. The body was left exposed, allowing birds and beasts to feed, denying the victim proper burial. In pagan thought, to be left unburied was to be erased from memory, a fate worse than death itself. The stake, too, carried spiritual meaning long before Christianity. To drive wood or iron through a man's body was to pin him to the world, preventing his spirit from wandering. It was both execution and containment. Bodies impaled or nailed to posts have been found throughout northern Europe, their bones still bearing the scars of spikes. The act echoed ancient myths of gods bound or pierced as punishment. It also reflected the human need to control what was feared: the restless dead, the dishonored, the dangerous. Roman observers recorded how northern tribes combined these methods. A criminal might be hanged from a tree and then burned. Another might be nailed to a wheel and left by a crossroads. These crossroads themselves were sacred spaces, intersections of human and spiritual paths. Executing someone there made his death a message in every direction, a warning that reached far beyond his own tribe. By the late Iron Age, ritual and punishment had become indistinguishable. Festivals that once celebrated the gods now included public executions. The people gathered not only to pray but to watch. The instruments of death, ropes, wheels, stakes, stood at the center like relics. The act of killing reaffirmed community, authority, and shared fear. The gods may have changed names, but the principle stayed: pain maintained the world. When Christianity eventually spread through these lands, it absorbed more than it erased. The stake and the wheel remained, now dressed in new words: justice, penance, purification. The forest was cleared, the groves cut down, but the structure of ritual persisted. The difference was only who the act was meant to honor. Archaeological digs across Germany, Denmark, and Poland have uncovered layers of ash and bone beneath early medieval gallows hills, showing continuity from pagan to Christian eras. In the soil, one can see how slow the change truly was. 1,000 years may pass, but the human belief in visible punishment endures. The woods became courts. The courts became cities, yet the wheel and the stake remain symbols of the same truth. Power demands spectacle. In a world that began in ritual and ended in rule, torture did not disappear. It adapted, and as long as fear remained the foundation of order, the cries of the condemned continued to echo across open ground, through forests once sacred, across villages now civilized, carried by wind as they always had been. The story of the brazen bull begins in ancient Sicily, long before northern Europe knew the cross or the gallows. It was one of the earliest examples of torture designed not just to kill, but to demonstrate power through spectacle. Though Greece and Rome later adopted similar methods, the bull remained unique, a machine built to turn human agony into performance. According to ancient sources, the device was commissioned by Phalaris, a tyrant who ruled the city of Acragas in the 6th century BCE. Phalaris wanted a new way to execute criminals and enemies, one that would instill fear and entertain at the same time. The sculptor Perillos designed it, a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a full-sized bull, with a door cut into its side and pipes hidden in the nostrils. When a man was locked inside and a fire lit beneath, the metal heated quickly, turning the interior into an oven. The victim's screams, forced through the pipes, echoed like the bellowing of a living animal. The cruelty of the invention was deliberate. The outside of the bull shone like gold, the inside blackened with soot. When the fire roared, the smell of burning flesh mixed with the metallic tang of heated bronze. The sound, distorted, animal-like, made it difficult for onlookers to tell if what they heard was human. In that confusion lay its purpose: to dehumanize, to turn execution into art. Though the brazen bull began as an instrument of tyranny, it carried the logic of ritual familiar across the pagan world. Fire was a purifier. Heat separated body and spirit. In some records, the deaths were even described as offerings to the gods, the bull symbolizing Zeus or Baal, the fire carrying the soul upward in smoke. In others, it was used purely as punishment for treason or blasphemy. Either way, the result was the same: a slow, suffocating death, while the crowd watched in fascination and horror. Over time, the story became legend. Ancient historians claim that Phalaris himself was eventually executed in his own creation, an act of poetic justice recorded by both Diodorus Siculus and Pindar. Whether this truly happened is unknown, But the myth endured because it captured the perfect symmetry of cruelty. The inventor consumed by his own invention. Replicas and variations of the brazen bull appeared elsewhere. Bronze cauldrons and iron cages used for burning victims alive have been found across the Mediterranean and the Near East. In Carthage, fire sacrifices known as mulk were made to the god Baal Hammon. Children and adults were placed into bronze effigies, the flames licking their bodies as priests chanted prayers. In some Greek sanctuaries, condemned men were thrown into large metal vessels heated from below, not for gods, but for display. The ritual of the bull was more than punishment, it was demonstration. Fire offered a kind of logic. It left no blood on the hands of the executioner, only smoke rising toward the heavens. To the pagan mind, that smoke was proof that the act had meaning. It carried the essence of the victim to the gods, turning horror into worship. If you had stood near one of those bulls, the experience would have been overwhelming. The sound of crackling wood beneath metal, the glow shifting from dull orange to blinding white, the smell of burning hair and oil, the crowd's silence breaking only when the first groan echoed through the pipes, the heat radiating outward, making everyone step back even as they stared. The fire reflected in their eyes, a mirror of what power meant. The brazen bull became a symbol of how far human belief and cruelty could merge. It was not born from chaos but from design. Someone had thought carefully about airflow, acoustics and appearance, the technical precision of murder. Later generations would look back and call it barbaric, but to those who lived under Phalaris, it was order. It reminded them who commanded life and death. Centuries after the tyrant's fall, the idea of fire as punishment survived. The Romans burned criminals, the Inquisition burned heretics, and across pagan Europe, fire remained the final proof that justice had been served. From sacred groves to bronze bulls, the method changed but the meaning did not. Fire cleansed and suffering made the world make sense again. The blood eagle remained more legend than lore, but it was never forgotten. Among the sagas, it reappears again and again, always tied to vengeance, always performed upon someone who had broken an oath. The act, whether real or symbolic, held a terrible consistency. The ribs carved open, the lungs drawn out like wings. It was the pagan world's most detailed expression of divine retribution. A sentence so extreme that even centuries later, writers used it to define what it meant to suffer for betrayal. In the Orkneyinga saga and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the blood eagle was not described as an isolated event. It belonged to a code. It happened only to those whose crimes offended both human and divine law. The body became the message, carved and displayed so that everyone who saw it would understand the price of dishonor. In this sense, it was as much sculpture as execution, a ritual demonstration of control. To understand how this could exist, one must understand what oaths meant in Viking society. Words were sacred currency. A man's promises bound him to his family, his gods, and his ancestors. To break one was to destroy not only his own honor, but the spiritual balance of the world. When vengeance came, it had to be just as extreme as the betrayal itself. Simple death was not enough. The offender had to be made into a warning. Descriptions of the blood eagle vary in detail, but the central image stays constant. The back opened, the ribs pulled apart, the lungs placed outward. It was not simply dismemberment, it was transformation. The victim's body, once human, was reshaped into the form of a creature sacred to Odin. The eagle was the symbol of the sky, of war, of divine vision. Turning a traitor into that shape reversed his fate. Instead of ascending, he was condemned to die as a grotesque parody of flight. Archaeology cannot confirm that any single person died this way, but evidence from the Viking Age shows a deep obsession with symbolism in death. Warriors were buried with weapons arranged carefully beside them. Captives were buried differently, their bones scattered, their skulls crushed, their torsos mutilated. These contrasts show that execution was not only about killing, but about meaning. The blood eagle fit perfectly into that structure, punishment as ritual art. To those who performed it, the act may have carried layers of belief. It imitated the myth of Odin himself, who hung from the world tree and suffered for knowledge. To open a man's back, to expose his lungs and spine, was to reenact divine sacrifice in reverse. The gods bled for wisdom, traitors bled for justice. In that reversal lay the balance that every pagan culture sought. The setting mattered. Accounts placed the blood eagle on open ground, near the sea or under the cold northern sky. The victim was stripped, bound, and forced to kneel. The blade sharpened beforehand, cut deliberately, each strike a rhythm of intent. The sound of ribs cracking, the hiss of breath, the heavy silence of witnesses, all of it formed part of the ritual. The onlookers were not there for cruelty. They were there to see the restoration of order. If you could have stood among them, you would have felt the cold wind moving across the fjord. You would have seen the men standing motionless, their hands on sword hilts, faces expressionless. The victim's breath turned to mist as it left his body. There would have been no shouting, no laughter, only the slow grind of iron and bone. To the people watching, this was justice made visible. Modern scholars often ask whether such acts truly happened or if they were literary inventions. The truth likely lies between. Even if the blood eagle was never performed exactly as written, the fact that it was imagined says everything about the mentality of the age. Pain was not hidden from life. It was part of it, sacred, useful, and controlled. The ritual described the world as they understood it, a place where every oath had a cost, and every betrayal demanded blood. The bones found in Viking graves still tell fragments of this story. Deep cuts on ribs, clean breaks along the spine, mutilations that suggest careful work rather than random violence. These are traces of a culture that saw death as a tool, not an end. The blood eagle, whether fact or fear, embodied that belief more than any other tale. It showed that in the pagan mind, the boundary between faith and brutality did not exist. They were the same thing, carved together into rib and bone. The rituals of pain and death that defined pagan justice were not carried out in secrecy. They happened before witnesses, whole communities, who gathered to watch, to confirm, and to remember. The role of these witnesses was essential. Without eyes to see it, the act had no meaning. Punishment, sacrifice, and vengeance were performances, and those standing in the shadows were both audience and participants. When an execution or ritual killing took place, the people assembled in silence. The victims were not taken to hidden chambers or prisons. They were brought into open ground, fields, hillsides, or near sacred stones. The crowd formed a circle, careful not to cross the boundary of the ritual space. In some cultures, that boundary was marked by stones or rope. Crossing it without permission was sacrilege. The moment the ceremony began, the site belonged to the gods. The witnesses included everyone who mattered: warriors, elders, priests, and often the families of both victim and executioner. The presence of the community transformed the act into law. The watchers confirmed that justice had been served. Without their gaze, it was simply murder. With it, it became order. Accounts from both archaeological and written sources describe how organized these gatherings were. In Germanic tribes, victims were offered in groves to Odin, while villagers stood in attendance. In Celtic Gaul, the Druids carried out sacrifices before the assembled clans. In Scandinavia, executions during the Blot festival drew entire settlements. These were not chaotic crowds, they followed procedure. The leader or priest addressed the gods. The sentence was announced, and the ritual began. For the witnesses, the act carried lessons. They saw what disobedience meant, what betrayal earned, and what divine law demanded. Children grew up with these sights, learning early that life and pain were inseparable. The sound of screams, the sight of fire or blood, were not entertainment but education. Each display reminded them of how fragile their safety was, and how important it was to remain loyal to tribe and God. The emotional distance of the crowd was part of the ritual. Those who watched were not to show pity or anger. To interfere was to question divine will. The correct response was silence, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a nod. The suffering before them was not cruelty, but proof that the gods had accepted the offering. Even grief was regulated. The family of the condemned might stand apart, forbidden to mourn aloud until the ritual was finished. In some parts of northern Europe, the bodies of the executed were displayed for days. Wooden frames, stakes, and crosses held them high, visible from the roads. Travelers passing by saw not only death but instruction. The presence of crows, the stench of decay, all of it reinforced the lesson. Authority was sacred, and those who defied it would meet the same fate. At certain festivals, remains from older executions were dug up and reburied in new ceremonies. This practice gave power to the dead. The bones of the punished became relics of obedience, reminders that fear could keep peace longer than mercy ever could. In the minds of those who lived in these societies, that was not a contradiction. It was balance. The witnesses also acted as keepers of memory. They carried the details of what they saw, the method, the words spoken, the final sounds, and passed them down through story. That is why so many of these events survived into later sagas and legends. Each generation repeated the story of a sacrifice or execution, not to glorify it, but to remember the structure it preserved. Fear bound communities together, and stories kept fear alive long after the fires went out. Even when Christianity arrived, the habit of public witnessing did not disappear. It simply changed language. Pagan sacrifices became Christian punishments. Sacred groves became gallows hills. The purpose remained, to show the people what happens when order is broken. Those who stood in the shadows of these acts were not spectators to cruelty. They were guardians of continuity. They watched because the act was not meant to vanish. It was meant to echo, to remind, to teach. Their silence gave the killing meaning. Without them, there was no ritual. Without their memory, no law. When the killing was finished and the last cries had faded into the air, what followed was silence. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. The crowd would stand still, watching the body that only minutes earlier had been alive, breathing, speaking. Now it was an object, a vessel emptied of meaning except for what it symbolized. That silence, more than the screams, marked the completion of the ritual. The priests or elders would move first. They approached the corpse, inspecting it for signs that the sacrifice had been accepted. The shape of the wounds, the position of the head, even the way the blood pooled, all were read as omens. A clean death, without struggle or broken ritual sequence, was a good sign. It meant the gods were satisfied. A messy or interrupted killing was dangerous. It could mean the offering was rejected, that misfortune would continue. In such cases, the ritual might be repeated. Sometimes another victim was chosen on the spot. After this inspection, the community began to disperse. Some people went quietly back to their homes, others lingered. In some regions, small tokens, bits of bread, drink, or flowers, were left near the body as secondary offerings. The priests washed their hands and blades in water or ash, symbolic purification before rejoining the living. The executioners did not speak for a time. In some traditions, they fasted for several days, not out of remorse but to cleanse themselves of divine contact. They had been instruments of the gods, and that role had to end before they could return to ordinary life. The site itself was never treated as ordinary again. Fields that had seen blood were left fallow. Trees used for hangings were considered sacred. Lakes or bogs that swallowed victims were avoided or fenced. The land had absorbed something powerful. In later centuries, people continued to fear these places, saying they were haunted or cursed. But in the beginning, they were respected. The silence around them was deliberate, a sign that the world there had changed. The physical remains of such acts still carry that silence. Archaeologists uncover it in the careful way bodies were positioned, the offerings placed nearby, the absence of haste. The ground tells of pauses, of order, of moments when tools were set down with precision. There was no chaos. After the blood was spilled, calm returned like ritual punctuation, a full stop written in flesh. They believed they had done what was necessary to restore balance. The air after such an event must have felt different, heavy, warm from the fires, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood. People walked home through it, past the boundary stones, into the darkness, carrying relief that the gods would leave them alone for another season. If you had been there, you would have noticed how ordinary the silence became. The birds returned to the trees. The fire burned low. The ground began to absorb what had been spilled. No one spoke of guilt, because guilt did not exist in their vocabulary. There was only duty fulfilled and danger postponed. The peace that followed was not moral but practical, a fragile quiet before the next crisis. Over time, the rituals grew rarer, but the memory of the silence remained. In folk tales told centuries later, heroes still visit sacred groves where the air feels heavy, where no animals stir. These stories preserve the emotion of that aftermath. Not horror, but weight, as if the land itself remembered what it had been fed. When archaeologists excavate those same sites today, they describe the same feeling. The ground is still damp and cold. Every artifact is found in careful arrangement, untouched for 2,000 years. Even in death, the order remains. The silence after the blood has lasted longer than the civilizations that made it. After the blood dried and the people were gone, objects were left behind, things meant to hold the memory of what had happened. Across Europe, archaeologists find them still, iron blades bent deliberately so they could never cut again, ropes coiled neatly beside bones, wooden stakes burned black at the tips. Each one marked a moment when violence was turned into meaning. Objects were the language of memory in pagan society. There were no written records, no scrolls or books to describe what a ritual meant. Instead, the tools and remnants told the story. A cracked knife meant a sacrifice had been made. A post driven deep into the ground marked where power had been exercised. Stones stacked in a ring marked the border between the sacred and the ordinary. To those who returned later, these things were proof that balance had once been restored. Weapons were especially symbolic. Swords and spears used in sacrifice were often broken afterward. This act, called ritual killing of objects, was common among Celts and Germans alike. Destroying a weapon meant releasing its spirit to the gods, just as the victim's soul had been released. Many such weapons have been found in rivers and bogs, bent or twisted, placed carefully among human remains. The offering of man and metal together represented the unity of war, death, and belief. Bones themselves became objects of memory. Skulls were removed, cleaned, and displayed. In some settlements, they were built into walls or buried beneath doorways to guard the home. The Celts believed the head held the essence of a person. Keeping it preserved the strength of their spirit. In temples, rows of skulls were mounted like trophies, a grim reminder that the tribe had power and that its gods had been fed. The distinction between warrior and priest blurred. Killing was an act of worship. The relics that followed were its scripture. At certain sites in Denmark and northern Germany, archaeologists found wooden idols carved into human forms, standing above pits filled with bones. The idols are simple, blank faces, hollow eyes, arms outstretched. They were probably placed there to represent gods who had received the offering. Some still have stains of blood on them, preserved by the peat. These figures stood for centuries, weathering and cracking, their presence a silent continuation of the ritual. Ropes, chains, and bindings also served as memory. Instead of being discarded, they were buried with the dead. In several bogs, cords were wrapped around the neck or arms of the deceased long after death, perhaps as a reminder of how the victim had met their fate. To the living, the preserved knots were sacred, physical proof of obedience to divine order. Even centuries later, when the exact meaning was forgotten, people avoided disturbing them. Sometimes these objects were made intentionally to rot. Wooden bowls, woven mats, or cloth soaked in blood were left in the open to decay under the elements. The process itself was part of the ritual, allowing nature to consume the remains just as the gods consume the soul. In their decomposition, these materials mirrored the passing of the human body. Even the locations became objects of memory. A tree used for hangings became a landmark, its name remembered through generations. Stones surrounding a sacrificial site were left untouched even when fields were plowed. Villages expanded around them, but never over them. Farmers built fences to keep their cattle away, not from respect for the dead, but from fear that disturbing the place might bring misfortune. Every object, every mark, served the same purpose, to ensure that what had been done was not forgotten. Pagan societies believed that forgetting was dangerous. If the gods were not reminded of what had been offered, they might demand payment again. The physical evidence of sacrifice, the twisted sword, the burned post, the buried bones, acted as proof of a completed debt. Thousands of years later, those same objects still speak. Museums display them behind glass, but they carry the same weight they did when first buried. Their purpose has changed, but their power remains. What began as ritual became archaeology, and what once spoke to gods now speaks to history. The world that created these rituals was not as simple or chaotic as it might appear from the outside. Pagan Europe was not a continent of random violence or endless superstition. It was structured, deeply organized, and built on a logic that governed every part of life. What seems to modernize like brutality was, to them, a coherent system, a balance between human duty, divine expectation, and the forces of nature that ruled survival. Each tribe or region had its hierarchy of gods, spirits, and natural powers. The Norse had Odin, Thor, and Freyr. The Celts honored Lugh, Brigid, and Danu. The Balts worshipped Perkunas, Divas, and Lima. Every one of these deities had specific demands and moods. They ruled over weather, war, fertility, harvest, and death. To ignore them was to invite disaster. The violence of sacrifice existed within this framework, not as cruelty but as negotiation. Ritual specialists knew what each god required. Water demanded drowning. Fire demanded burning. The sky demanded hanging. The earth demanded burial. Each element had its own price. The priests, druids, or gothi acted as intermediaries, interpreting the will of unseen powers and translating it into human action. Their role was not questioned. Their knowledge came from ancestry, not invention. They believed they maintained the equilibrium that kept storms from destroying crops and plagues from spreading through villages. The ordinary person accepted this without doubt. In societies where nature could wipe out a community overnight, belief was not optional. People lived close to death. Winter could starve a family. Disease could wipe out half a village. Offering life, animal or human, seemed logical when faced with such uncertainty. The gods were not cruel. They were simply powerful, and those who respected them survived longer than those who didn't. Even within this framework, rules existed. Not every killing was permitted. The act had to follow procedure, proper preparation of the victim, correct timing of the ritual, the right prayers, and the presence of witnesses. A sacrifice done incorrectly was worse than none at all. It could anger the gods further. That fear kept discipline among those who performed the rituals. There were laws of holiness, just as there were laws of war and trade. Cultural layers also shaped the meaning of these acts. In the far north, where winters lasted most of the year, fire was sacred, a force that symbolized both warmth and destruction. In the fertile valleys of Gaul, rivers carried the dead to the gods of water. In the Baltic, lightning was revered. The burning of offerings imitated the strike of Perkunas himself. Across these lands, torture and killing followed consistent patterns, because the worldview behind them was consistent. The universe demanded payment. and humans provided it. Archaeological sites confirm this complexity. Offerings were often accompanied by carefully arranged animal remains, pottery and tools. These combinations were not random. They represented the full cycle of life, labor, nourishment, and death, all returned to the divine in one act. In this way, ritual sacrifice was as much about gratitude as it was about fear. When Romans and later Christians described these people as barbarians, they misunderstood that structure. To the tribes, sacrifice was not savagery, it was theology. Every cut, every flame, every scream had meaning. It maintained a fragile relationship between visible and invisible worlds. Without it, they believed chaos would consume everything. The complexity of these pagan worlds becomes clearer the deeper one studies them. Even torture was layered with symbolism. The use of fire echoed myths of renewal, where death was the seed of creation. The spilling of blood onto the earth returned life to soil that gave it. These systems of belief endured for centuries because they worked, not in the literal sense of changing weather, but in uniting people under shared purpose. When a community believed together, it survived together. Every ritual, every death, every offering served as reinforcement of identity. People did not live as individuals. They lived as parts of an ongoing covenant with powers larger than themselves. In that context, what modern people call pagan torture was not an expression of evil, but of structure, a reflection of how societies made sense of fear, death, and responsibility. These acts were not senseless. They were systems. The brutality was real, but it was framed by order, not chaos. The complexity of those worlds reminds us that human beings have always sought meaning in suffering. They needed their pain to count for something. For them, it counted for survival. Even in those ages of violence and ritual death, not everything was darkness. Within the same societies that bound men to trees and burned them for the gods, there existed rules of fairness, hospitality, and care for kin. People lived hard lives, but they also shared food, raised children together, and looked after the sick and the elderly when they could. The same hands that carried the knife or the torch during sacrifice also built homes, brewed ale, and buried the dead with tenderness. Paganism was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a worldview that mixed fear with reverence. To survive the long winters of the north or the poor harvests of the west, people believed they needed harmony. The same fires that once burned offerings later warmed their families. Archaeological finds tell this quieter story too. At sites like Uppsala in Sweden and Navan Fort in Ireland, layers of ash from sacrifices lie beside traces of communal meals, discarded animal bones, fragments of pottery, drinking vessels. These were not scenes of horror but of gathering. After the killing, the people ate together, drinking to the gods and to one another. In their minds, death and nourishment were parts of the same cycle. They gave, and then they received. Life in those societies demanded cooperation. Farming, hunting, building, even defense against neighboring tribes. None of it could be done alone. The rituals that look cruel to modern eyes also strengthened bonds. When an entire community stood together through the tension of sacrifice, it reminded them that their fate was shared. The individual life meant little, but the group meant everything. There were also boundaries to violence. Certain days and places were forbidden for bloodshed. Groves used for offerings could not be used for battle. Weapons were left outside during festivals. Women and children were rarely chosen as victims except in the most desperate circumstances. When animals were sacrificed, their meat was divided equally, the act seen as both devotion and fairness. For all their harshness, these people followed moral codes as strict as any later religion. If you walked among them between the rituals, you would not see savages but families. People grinding grain, sewing clothes, repairing tools, telling stories by firelight. You would hear laughter, gossip, argument. Their lives were filled with labor and faith, not constant blood. Sacrifice happened rarely, only when needed, because it carried risk. Killing wrongly could offend the gods as easily as appease them. It was a dangerous conversation with the divine, never entered lightly. Even their concept of death was not purely grim. They believed in continuity, that the spirit did not vanish but changed form. Ancestors watched over the living. Crops grew from ground that had received offerings, and winter always gave way to spring. The darkness of their world was real, but so was their hope. They understood that life could only exist because death did. The difference between the two was not moral, but natural. Many modern interpretations forget this balance and paint pagan life only in extremes, either noble and peaceful or savage and monstrous. The truth lies between. These were societies trying to understand the same things every generation faces: why the world suffers, why people die, and how to make sense of forces beyond control. Their answers were different, but their questions were human. The light in the long dark was not the absence of cruelty, but the endurance of meaning. They found dignity in survival, faith in ritual, and purpose in the repetition of life and death. Their days were short, their winters endless, but they built continuity through belief. Even in the shadow of sacrifice, they kept living, building, and hoping. Not because they loved pain, but because they believed it kept the sun coming back. In their eyes, the gods were neither merciful nor cruel. They were reflections of life itself, capable of giving, capable of taking. The people who served them understood that truth better than most. They did not fear death as modern minds do. They feared disorder. As long as the world kept its rhythm, blood for soil, fire for life, darkness for light, they believed that all was as it should be. As the centuries turned, the old gods began to fade. The same rituals that had once defined power and faith started to lose their authority. Across Europe, new ideas arrived, carried first by traders, then by soldiers, and finally by priests. The Christian cross replaced the sacred tree, and churches rose where groves once stood. But the transition was not immediate or clean. For generations, the old beliefs coexisted with the new, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, as one world tried to erase another. In the beginning, Christianity spread not through conquest but through adaptation. Missionaries learned local languages, borrowed customs, and reshaped them into acceptable forms. Pagan festivals became saints' days, sacrificial fires became candlelight. The people who once offered blood to Odin or Perkunas now offered bread and wine to Christ. But the emotion was the same: fear, hope, and reverence. The old instincts didn't vanish, they changed form. The new religion condemned the killings, calling them barbaric and sinful. Yet in practice, public executions continued. The language shifted from sacrifice to justice, but the structure remained. The gallows replaced the sacred oak. The stake that had once held an offering to the gods now held heretics and witches. The ritual of death, so deeply embedded in European culture, survived under a different name. By the early Middle Ages, kings who once ruled as mediators between gods and people now ruled by divine right under a single god. Their authority was no longer tied to fertility or weather, but to law and conquest. Yet echoes of the old sovereignty sacrifices lingered. Coronations still used anointing oils that symbolized divine favor. Oaths were sworn over relics instead of idols. The belief that rulers could lose legitimacy through misfortune persisted. When famine struck, people still whispered that their king had lost God's grace. The same logic that had once condemned a failed pagan ruler to the bog. Rural areas resisted the longest. A few still sacrificed people, criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war, though by then such acts were outlawed. In Sweden, at Uppsala, human offerings were said to have taken place until the late 1000s. Witnesses spoke of bodies hanging in groves beside animals, the scent of blood drifting through the temple air. When Christian rulers finally destroyed these sites, they built churches directly over them, as if to seal the power beneath. Even then, the transition was not complete. The new faith inherited the old fascination with spectacle. Where once people gathered to appease gods through pain, they now gathered to punish sinners. The theology changed, but the psychology did not. The wheel, the stake, the fire, all survived as instruments of penance. People still believed that suffering purified, that pain could cleanse corruption. The language of sacrifice had simply been rewritten. Over the centuries, memory of the old rituals decayed, but fragments remained in folklore. Villagers told stories of cursed hills, haunted trees, and bogs that swallowed the wicked. These were not just ghost tales, they were the echoes of sacred places once used for offerings. Even the church absorbed some of these fears. It warned against spirits in the forest and forbidden rites, but in doing so it kept their presence alive in collective memory. Archaeology now reveals how gradual the fading truly was. Beneath medieval churches lie layers of burned earth, animal bones, and human remains, signs of older worship beneath Christian stone. The priests who consecrated those buildings may not have known what lay underfoot, but the people did. They remembered. They prayed to the cross, but they still poured the first sip of ale onto the ground for the ancestors. The fading of old power was not a single moment, but a slow erosion. One belief replaced another only when the world around it changed. When life grew more stable, when famine and war receded, when written law replaced oral tradition, people no longer needed to bargain with gods through blood. Yet even then, the idea that pain carried meaning never disappeared. It shifted into confession, martyrdom, punishment. The same structure dressed in different symbols. By the time Europe was fully Christian, the sacred groves were gone, the bogs forgotten, and the idols buried. But the memory of what they stood for, the belief that the world must be fed to remain in balance, lingered in human instinct. The old gods were silenced, yet their logic lived on in every fire that burned a sinner, every sword raised in holy war, every law that demanded suffering in exchange for peace. The names changed, but the pattern remained. Power still demanded pain. Centuries passed, and the world that once sacrificed to unseen gods became history. But the evidence of that world never vanished. It remained buried beneath the soil, sealed in the cold water of bogs and lakes, waiting. The peat preserved not only flesh and bone, but belief itself. When those bodies and relics were uncovered thousands of years later, they spoke again, quietly, without words, through their wounds and their stillness. Archaeology gave the old rituals a second life. Each excavation pulled fragments of faith back into daylight. In Denmark, the Tolen man's face looked as though he were only sleeping. His features soft, his eyes closed, the rope still tight around his neck. In Ireland, old Crogan man's skin still bore the mark of a blade that cut 2,000 years earlier. In England's Lindo Moss, a man's broken skull and slit throat told of a triple sacrifice meant to please multiple gods at once. These discoveries forced modern people to look into the eyes of the past and see the order inside the cruelty. The bones, the bindings, and the objects found beside them, all of it created a map of memory. They showed where people had gathered, where they had prayed, where they had killed. Each find revealed repetition, the same positions, the same types of wounds, the same placements of tools. The uniformity proved that these were not random acts of violence, but ceremonies repeated for generations. The bogs had become archives of belief. The archaeologists who uncovered them often described a feeling of unease, not from fear but from recognition. The faces of the dead looked human, ordinary, familiar. Their expressions were calm, not twisted in agony. They looked like people who had accepted what was coming, an understanding that death had meaning. This disturbed modern observers because it showed how belief can make horror seem holy. As science advanced, even the smallest traces were studied. Isotope analysis revealed where the victims had lived, what they had eaten, and how they had been treated before death. Some had been well fed and cared for, perhaps prepared as chosen offerings. Others bore signs of struggle and restraint, suggesting punishment. The mixture blurred the line between volunteer and victim, between faith and enforcement. What mattered most was that each body represented an act of deliberate ritual. The bogs did not only preserve bodies, they preserved moments of contact between humans and the divine. Pots of food left near corpses, broken weapons, jewelry, and even wooden idols stood as physical echoes of a worldview that refused to die. The peat's darkness became a time capsule, a memory made solid. Every object told the same story. Once people believed that life depended on the giving of life. In museums, those remains now rest under glass. Visitors stand in silence before them, feeling the same mixture of awe and discomfort. They see not monsters, but humans who lived by a logic foreign yet understandable. The bog bodies are not anonymous artifacts. They are the final testimony of an entire way of seeing the world. The wrinkles in their skin, the cords around their necks, the positioning of their hands, each detail whispers of intention. These discoveries also exposed continuity. The same instinct that drove Iron Age people to appease the gods still appears in later cultures. The need to assign reason to suffering, to believe pain has value. The bogs made this continuity undeniable. They reminded humanity that civilization changes quickly, but belief changes slowly. The people who sacrificed to Odin or to earth spirits were separated from us not by savagery, but by circumstance. They lived closer to death, and in that closeness, they tried to make sense of it. The silence of those preserved faces tells what words cannot. They show that even in a world defined by violence, there was intention, structure, ritual, and meaning. The peat preserved not only the dead, but the thought behind their deaths. Each body, each broken blade, each knot tied around a wrist, is both confession and explanation. This is how we kept the world alive. The echoes remain, not in religion but in memory. We still bury our dead with ceremony. We still build monuments to suffering. We still need our pain to mean something. The bogs only make that truth visible. The bones of the past do not accuse, they remind. They show what humans have always done when faced with the fear of loss. They create order from it. In that way, the old sacrifices never truly ended. They changed shape, as everything in human belief eventually does. Remembering these things is uncomfortable, but necessary. To understand how far humanity has come, you have to see what it once accepted as normal. The pagan sacrifices and tortures of the past are not only stories of cruelty, they are lessons about fear, belief, and the human need for control. Every culture has searched for a way to explain suffering. The difference between then and now is not that people stopped being violent, it's that they learned to call their violence by different names. For those ancient societies, pain was purpose. It gave structure to chaos. They did not kill because they loved death. They killed because they believed it kept life moving forward. That belief deserves to be studied, not excused, because it shows how faith and power intertwine. When people are certain they act for a higher cause, there is little they will not justify. The history of pagan torture is not separate from modern history. It is its foundation. The same impulse that drove priests to cut throats in sacred groves later drove inquisitors to light fires beneath heretics, kings to execute rebels, nations to wage holy wars. The words changed, the gods changed, but the reasoning stayed. Suffering purifies, and order is worth any price. Understanding the old rituals means seeing the pattern that repeats itself through time. Archaeology exposes the facts, but memory gives them meaning. The bogged bodies, the burned bones, the twisted swords, these are not just remnants of barbarity. They are mirrors showing the human mind's constant search for certainty. Even now, people find comfort in structure, in punishment, in sacrifice. We still build systems that trade freedom or compassion for safety. We still believe that pain must balance the scales of life. Remembering is also an act of honesty. The past should not be romanticized or hidden behind myth. Paganism was not noble simplicity, nor was it endless savagery. It was a human response to a hostile world. Forgetting that would mean pretending that people are fundamentally different now, that faith can no longer turn into cruelty. But history shows otherwise. Every age finds its own way to demand sacrifice. The importance of remembering lies in empathy as much as warning. When you look at the faces of those preserved in peat, you're not staring at strangers. You're seeing people who lived by rules they did not invent, born into systems they could not question. Some believed their death would save others. Some simply had no choice. That awareness bridges time, a recognition that humans, regardless of era, are shaped by the worlds they inherit. To remember is also to resist repetition. Every time the story of the old rituals is told truthfully, without censorship, without exaggeration, it reminds us what happens when belief is left unexamined. When authority claims to speak for gods, when obedience replaces thought, when fear becomes virtue, the old patterns return. They may no longer involve ropes and blades, but they follow the same structure. Submission through suffering. What the pagans left behind, the bones, the idols, the scars, are not just evidence of their world. They are warnings written in flesh. They show how easily necessity becomes ritual, and ritual becomes law. The people who once killed for rain or harvests believed they were protecting their families. So did those who later burned heretics or waged wars of faith. The reasons always sound noble. The results always look the same. To remember is to face that truth without turning away. The past was not a nightmare that ended. It was the beginning of a story still unfolding. The bogs, the gallows, the fires. They are chapters of the same book. Studying them means reading our own handwriting in the margins. History does not punish or forgive. It only records. What we choose to do with its record decides whether the next chapters repeat what came before. When the last of the sacrifices faded into memory, life carried on. Villages grew into towns, temples became churches, and the groves that once echoed with chants fell silent under new fields and roads. But something of that old world lingered. It lived not in worship or ritual, but in instinct, the quiet sense that the balance of life could still be broken if people forgot to respect what they could not control. By the early medieval centuries, most of Europe had moved on. The fires that once burned for the gods now lit hearths for families. People spoke prayers instead of incantations. The world no longer required offerings of blood, only the labor of human hands. The old places, the bogs, the standing stones, the tree circles, began to sink back into the earth. Their meanings were forgotten, replaced by rumor and superstition. Some were said to be cursed, others sacred. Few dared to disturb them. In that way, the silence that followed was not emptiness but endurance. The land itself became the keeper of memory. Beneath farms and villages, the peat still held its sleepers. Beneath churches, buried idols and ashes waited. No one spoke of the gods who had once demanded such things, but the echoes of them remained in the soil, in the old stories told around fireplaces when the nights grew long. If you could have walked through those centuries, you would have seen a world both new and old at once. Men plowed over sacred fields without knowing it. Children played near stones that marked ancient altars. Women drew water from wells that had once swallowed offerings. The blood was gone, but the feeling remained, a faint pull in certain places, as if the earth itself remembered. The people of the New Age lived differently, but not without fear. They prayed to one God now, yet the same anxieties endured. The fear of famine, of disease, of storms, of death. They still searched for reasons and patterns. They still needed to believe that suffering meant something. And so, though the names changed, the need did not. The gods of thunder and fire became saints and angels. The rites became rituals of prayer and fasting. The shape of faith was different, but its weight felt the same. Every culture carries its ghosts. The silence that followed the pagan world was full of them. The air over the old groves still felt heavy. travelers still crossed themselves when passing bogs that smelled of decay. Songs and legends softened the edges of the truth but kept its outline. They spoke of kings who vanished into swamps, of lights that flickered above the water on winter nights. No one said the word sacrifice, but everyone understood what those lights meant. Inside the homes of the new believers, fire became a comfort instead of a threat. Families gathered around it to cook, to tell stories, to pray. The same element that once consumed victims now warmed children. The crackle of burning wood replaced the screams of the condemned. In that transformation lay the greatest change of all. Not the end of belief, but the redirection of it. Humanity had finally turned the fire inward, toward life, instead of death. Yet even that warmth carried memory. The hearth was more than a place of heat. It was a small, controlled echo of the sacred fires that once rose to the sky. Each spark was a reminder of what had been given to keep the world alive. People no longer said the words, but they still felt the need to feed the flame. Bread was baked, candles burned, offerings replaced by daily ritual. The same rhythm of give and take, only softened. The quiet that followed the pagan age was not peace in the modern sense. It was adjustment, the slow settling of belief after centuries of blood. The old gods were buried, but their shadows stretched through time. They survived in stories of dragons, demons, saints who fought serpents, heroes who faced darkness and paid with their lives. These tales carried the same truth as the sacrifices, that life demanded courage, and that order always came at a price. The hearth grows quiet, but the memory in the flame remains. Every civilization leaves something behind, not just monuments and bones, but instincts. Humanity still looks for balance, still fears chaos, still believes that suffering can restore meaning. The faces in the bogs are gone, but the impulse that created them has never left us. It only learned to whisper instead of scream. The fire burns low. Only embers remain now, faint, red and alive against the darkness. In the quiet, the world feels older, heavier, as if time itself were pausing to breathe. This is how every story of humanity ends, not with a final word, but with warmth fading into silence. The pagan world has vanished, yet its ashes still glow beneath everything that followed. The instincts that built the altars, the logic that demanded balance through pain, they never disappeared. They changed shape, buried beneath centuries of new beliefs, new laws, new gods. But deep within people, the same questions still burn. Why must there be suffering? What does it mean to pay for peace? When the archaeologist bends over a pit of dark soil and finds the outline of a bone or the coil of a rope, the past breathes again. The peat releases its scent, metallic, sweet, old. In that moment, the distance between then and now collapses. The same fears that once led men to kill in sacred groves now drive them to seek reason in science, justice, and progress. The forms have changed, the rituals have shifted, but the search is the same, to make sense of the uncontrollable. The embers flicker, casting shadows that resemble movement. For a moment, it's easy to imagine faces in them. The witnesses, the priests, the victims. Their stories no longer belong to religion or even history. They belong to humanity itself. Every age carries its own version of sacrifice. Every society decides whose pain will keep the rest alive. The fires that once burned people now power machines. The fear that once filled the forests now fills cities. The words have changed: progress, order, necessity, but the pattern is familiar. The embers whisper it quietly, that no belief system ever truly ends. It only cools, waiting for breath or spark to bring it back. To lie beside those embers, to feel their heat fading, is to understand how close the present still is to the ancient world. Humanity does not forget, it transforms. The sacrifices of the pagans became the punishments of kings, the purges of empires, the wars of nations. The tools grew sharper, the reasons more complex, but the structure remained. Suffering used to build meaning, control, and unity. Yet there is something else in the fire, something gentler. In the same flames that once destroyed, there is warmth, creation, and renewal. The people who first worshipped it saw both sides clearly. They knew that what gives life can also take it away. That understanding, stripped of ritual and fear, is what survives best of all. It's why people still gather around fires, still stare into their light in silence, still feel something old stir when wood cracks and sparks rise. The embers fade, the air cools, and only memory remains. The world that once howled with pain is quiet now. Its violence turned into history, its gods into stories, its rituals into lessons. But the truth beneath it all is still human. Everything done, the killings, the prayers, the sacrifices, was done to feel safe in a world that never promised safety. The fire dies down completely, leaving only the faint scent of smoke. The ground that once drank blood is still and dark. The people are gone, the gods forgotten. but their echoes linger in every belief that promises meaning through suffering. To sleep among the embers is to rest beside the past, not forgiving it, not fearing it, but knowing it. And when the morning comes, and light touches the ash, the world looks unchanged, but somewhere underneath, the memory remains, quiet, patient, waiting to be remembered again. History never truly ends. It folds back on itself, repeating patterns under new names. The world that once bowed to gods of thunder, war and harvest, still lives within the minds of those who came after, not through worship, but through instinct. The need to explain suffering, to justify power, to find order through pain. These are the quiet continuations of everything that came before. The sacrifices in the bogs, the fires in the groves, the screams carried on the wind. They were not isolated moments. They were humanity's first language with the unknown. Every age since has spoken some version of it. The altars became courtrooms, the priests became rulers, and the old prayers turned into laws. People no longer called their rituals sacrifices, but the reasoning behind them survived. Order demanded obedience. The bones preserved in peat, the scorched metal of the brazen bull, the deep scars cut into ribs. They all tell the same story, that belief is both the light that guides and the blade that wounds. Those who lived in the pagan world were not monsters. They were people trying to understand a dangerous universe. Their answers were carved in flesh, because flesh was what they had. If you stand before the glass case of a bog body today, the air still feels heavy. The skin is dark, stretched, human. The eyes, half closed, seem at peace. Time has softened the horror, but not erased it. What you see there is not just death. It's the echo of faith, fear, and logic colliding. It is proof that civilization is built not on comfort, but on confrontation with the unknown. The echoes reach further than most realize. They live in the instinct to punish, to control, to sacrifice one for the sake of many. They live in the comfort people find in rules, in the pride taken in endurance, in the belief that suffering earns redemption. These are not relics of the past. They are the inheritance of every age. History echoes not through words, but through repetition. The methods change, the tools evolve, but the structure remains the same. Humanity learns, forgets, and relearns the same lesson. That order born from pain always carries its own destruction. The pagans believed the gods required blood to keep the world alive. Later ages believed the same about justice, about truth, about progress. The names on the altars changed, but the fires never went out. To listen to those echoes is to face what history really is, not a record of progress, but a reflection of ourselves. Each discovery, each story of a sacrifice, each preserved body is a mirror. It shows what humans become when fear outweighs compassion, when certainty replaces doubt, when faith becomes law. The echo does not accuse, it warns, and so the story ends where it began, with people looking at the world and trying to understand it. The flames that once devoured flesh now flicker as candles in museums, as lights in study rooms, as screens where history is retold. The screams are gone, but the meaning remains. That is what it means for history to echo through time. It never stops speaking. It waits quietly in the things people believe, in the choices they justify, in the rituals they still perform without realizing what they are repeating. And when you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, not as sound, but as presence. The weight of what came before, still moving through everything that exists now. That was Echoes Through Time. See you again soon.